Welcome to Beyond the Accent, Speak Without Limits, the show where we explore the bilingual experience beyond the speech sounds. I'm Carrie, a voice coach, linguist, and expat, navigating life across cultures for over a decade now. This podcast is where language meets identity, and where you learn to speak with clarity, confidence, and purpose without limits. Each episode, we dive into the stories, struggles, and successes of people living the bilingual life, while sharing expert tips to help you unlock the full potential of your voice in English. Ready to explore what's beyond the accent? Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of my podcast, Beyond the Accent. The idea of podcasting has been percolating inside my brain for months on end, and I'm so glad that I finally arrived, and I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So just to reiterate, the show is about the intersections of language, culture, and identity. How the way we speak inadvertently shapes the way we experience the world and vice versa. Today, we're talking about love in translation, which is in fact also the name of the article that I read years ago, but I thought of it as the best to kick things off with. How does learning a partner's language change the relationship, and how does it change you? How does, what sort of dynamic does it create? The reason why I wanted to start with love, is because in real life, the many technical sides of language learning sort of spill over into the very life itself. The everyday, the quotidian, the routine, and the feelings that come with it. So I figured it would be relevant, would be relatable, real, raw, some of it, and most definitely thought-provoking. So let me tell you about love in translation. Lauren Collins is an American writer, a New Yorker. Well, she's also from North Carolina. Again, that's two different Englishes for you and two very different worlds that come with it. She's an American writer who falls in love with Olivier, a Frenchman, and they meet in London, so sort of a neutral territory, right? The language is hers, it's more or less European, and there they ran into each other. They date, they marry, and eventually they move to where? To Geneva. And there she realizes, okay, she cannot keep relying on English to navigate their life together. Not anymore. Not only on that, and not in Geneva. So she mentions the quote-unquote soulmate-method of language learning. That is, the idea that falling in love with a native speaker is basically the best way to master their language. And I do want to know what you guys make of that. Does that make sense to you? Does it always work? Because in truth, she reflects on why the method is not always easy and why it didn't work for her and her husband, not right off the bat anyways. French speakers, she says, and I know that, in my own experience, it's more or less the same, especially when you're in France as opposed to outside of France. French speakers across the board are language nuts. They're not just nerds, they're crazy. As Julie Barlow, who wrote The Story of French goes, debates about grammar rules and acceptable vocabulary are part of the intellectual landscape and a regular topic of small talk among francophones of all classes and origins. So it's kind of like movies in Anglo-American culture. We'll talk movies, they'll talk how do we go about the article usage? How do we go about the vocab placement? How do we go about the expression? La-di-da-di-da-di-da. So it's a very different type of focus. This obsession with precision makes French what? Both frustrating and fascinating to learn, right? And so she enrolls in intensive French classes, determined to learn not just the language, not just the typical grammar and vocab aspects of it, but also the deeper meaning behind how the language works and how her husband in particular communicates. This is where the whole aspect of identity comes in, right? So what you are and what you aren't, and what you're able to communicate in your second, third, and fourth language. She realizes that speaking another language unlocks deeper layers of intimacy, and that's a huge part of the article, the intimacy, the closeness, how close you can get in your many languages that you share. And it's not just about understanding what's being said, literally, right? And that goes, for monolingual relationships as well, but it's also about interpreting what's left unsaid. And it kind of gets ever more complicated, right? So in love, much is communicated in tone. It's communicated in rhythm and silence. So she writes, I'm going to quote, I was used to being the witty one. In French, I was reduced to the personality of a small child. The shift is very humbling to her, and it's very unsettling because, well, this was her personality, being able to make jokes, being able to, throw out punchlines, 1, 2, 3, 4, all throughout the conversation. And then she's reduced, I like how she uses the word reduced, to a very small part of herself. And that is the first block, the beginning part, the beginning chapter, the first chapter, the childhood. So there's a huge distance between your adult self and where you were years and years and years ago. And I can relate to that. And that is a good reason to really work on all of your competencies, just to grow your expressiveness and just to grow your portfolio. Because just being something and not being able to get it across is mighty frustrating. So she wonders who she really is. This is also interesting, when she's stripped of this linguistic confidence. You really don't have to be stripped of your confidence when you're stripped of your competences, because it's not like all of you goes away. There's so much at your disposal, but this, very much perfectionistic tendency to want to take all of you into this new space, into this new identity, into this new world right away, without years having passed, right? Because you want the best here right now. You don't want to wait. You don't want to work at it forever. You just want to be able to show yourself here and now. So no, like being able to show yourself in smaller bits and being able to keep that part of you that is not expressible just yet, sort of not locked away, but kind of dormant, without frustrating yourself, because it's ourselves that we frustrate first and foremost. That's a huge part of like communicative wisdom, right? So like, I remember myself being so frustrated over not being able to show all of myself to my French teacher, say 2.5 years ago, but she wouldn't let me slide into English or Russian. She would just go, en français, Caroline. And I was like, well, I cannot say what I want and when I feel en français. She's like, that's okay. And I knew as a teacher where she was coming from, but I know that feeling of not being your full self, but it's so important to navigate that with wisdom and patience. And it's also interesting how she talks about Olivier's journey with English as well, because he'd been learning it forever, and yet his scholastic school English, right, it done very little to prepare him for the realities of the language, quote unquote, on the ground. And we've most definitely come across that as learners, as expats, and as migrants, and as travelers. We come into this world of communication where people just live their lives in the language that's new to you. And it's like everything is twice as hard for you, twice as slow. And the things that are being thrown at you, they're just so unbearably authentic at times. And it's not very much comparable to what you were exposed to for years and years at school. And depends on the quality of the education that you were getting, most certainly. There's a huge distance between the reality and the imitation of reality that you get in a school setting, in a formal setting. It's a huge shock for the body, right? It's a huge shock is what it is. And so a 10-year student of English was being told by his classmates when he was in New York, you couldn't get a word out a couple months ago. You've gotten so good. Well, he got good at living in the language, but the language he had been good at for some time. And it's interesting how it's not the same thing at all. Well, that deals with competences more so than emotions and relationships. So let's get back into that. Collins highlights the differences between French and English cultures, right? Of course, those differences are critical to how they communicate. So she goes, in French, the grid was divided differently between public and private, rather than polite and rude. So she found the emphasis on formal distinctions, like using vous et tu for you, both fascinating and alienating. She was not feeling connected to it, to the very concept of distinguishing between the two. And at times it felt rigid and doctrinaire, very pedantic linguistically, if you will, and it made her long for the casual ease. I love that expression, the casual ease of English, where the egalitarian, and you'd think it's fraternité, égalité, a very much French concept, and yet the egalitarian spirit, you get that in English, not in French, for whatever the hell you want to say. Another striking idea that she explores is how language might give us different personalities. I want to do a whole episode on that. And I definitely want to invite people on my podcast to talk about the experiences that people have had. She writes, does each language have its own worldview? Do people have different personalities in different languages? And this idea, well, it tantalized her. And it most certainly fascinates me, just the very concept of being more than one person. The thought that a foreign language could unlock a parallel life of sorts, or even activate like a latent alter ego. Finally, though, she talks about people thinking of a new language as a refuge, like a place to hide from your, I don't know, your first language problems, if you will, your first country problems for sure. But she references the French scholar Alice Kaplan, who says the following: why do people want to adopt another culture? Because there's something in their own that they don't like, that doesn't name them. But for Collins, because she was not just learning it for fun or for work or for a very specific domain of her everyday living, but for her life in general, everyday life. French was not an uncomplicated refuge in any sense of the word. Right? Instead, she found herself navigating the complexities and becoming, as she said, the proprietor of a life suffused by French. So it wasn't always romantic, by no means. It was challenging, confusing. It was, it felt like an uphill battle to her. And it really is. If you go deep enough, it's not about hiding. It's not about finding the novel and ignoring the old. It's not about juxtaposing the two, but it's kind of, building this third version of yourself that has both first and second language, first and second culture, kind of playing with one another. And amalgamating into something that's completely different at the end of the day. And you're in between worlds. You're in this headspace, as a good friend of mine likes to put it. You're not really grounded at times because there's so many possibilities of what resonates with you at a given moment, depending on what language you're speaking and what person you're talking to and in what context you're finding yourself. So all this really hit home for me. I really want to know, have you ever felt like you couldn't fully be yourself in another language? It's like parts of your identity are locked away, waiting for you to find the right words, or the courage to speak imperfectly, which is something that I'm going to advocate for. You don't have to lock yourself away, but you are going to really work at the competencies of yours, vocab most certainly, to really, really be able to express yourself in full. But then again, I don't want you to be perfectionistic about it, because what the heck ever that means anyway, in full. You just want those percentages of freedom to how you express yourself to grow, right? And that comes with reading, with being exposed to the language that you're trying to get into yourself. You're trying to get yourself to be part of, I don't know, existentially. So what I love about Collins' story is how she frames language learning as an act of love in a way. She goes, learning a language is an act of empathy, right? You're trying to see the world as someone else sees it, right? And isn't that what love is per se? Trying to understand another person's reality. And I wonder if, the different languages make it easier in a way, because that's kind of a premise. Okay, we're different. We're going to have to work towards some kind of shared space in terms of what we want, what we know, and how we communicate it to the world, right? Or does it make things more difficult because there's this, extra component of difference? And she reflects on their everyday misunderstandings with humor, calling them funny, frustrating, but always, always illuminating, right? So there's a lot of new information on what the other person is like and what you are able to become through their instrument, that is through their language. And what is it that you're going to let in? What is it that you're going to leave out? That's always up to you. It's in those moments of miscommunication probably that you learn the most about someone and about yourself, right? About connecting and disconnecting and finding the willpower and the wisdom to, create a space for connecting. The cultural nuances, right? They also show up in everyday language, and this is a part that I really want to read out to you. I'll clean the kitchen after I finish my dinner, I'd say. First, I'm going to read my book. My dinner, he'd reply in a babyish voice. My book. To him, the tendency of English speakers to use the possessive pronoun, my, your, none was strictly necessary. It sounded immature, and he would make fun of it. And it's just so interesting, because it is going to signal this individualistic sort of essence of American English and of American culture. This is my book. This is my experience, my kitchen, my day. And it's just so interesting. And I love to talk about that to my students, how that my really does make a difference in terms of things sounding extra natural. Now, finally, the critic George Steiner defined intimacy as confident, quasi-immediate translation. And he wasn't even talking about languages necessarily. So loving someone from another culture means performing this feat of translating, feat of interpretation every day. Not just across languages, but across cultural understandings of love, gender roles, personal expression. Yeah, the article was written years ago, so I do wonder what it would have to say on gender today across languages, cultures, and I don't know, societal landscapes. So there we are. What's the takeaway here, right? To be in love is to be in translation. Whether or not you're learning a new language, love is about constantly interpreting. And I like that idea, adjusting and sometimes stumbling through the right words. So have you ever had a lost in translation moment, is what I want to ask of you, with someone that you personally care about, or someone you work with, or someone you are considering caring about? How did it change your relationship? How did it change you, if at all? How long did it take for you to actually have certain parts of you adjust? And I'd love to hear your stories. Send me a message, share your thoughts on social media. Maybe this week, pay attention to how your words and the silences in between carry meaning beyond language. Thank you so much for being here. Do share your ideas. Do tell me what it is you want us to talk about in the upcoming episodes, who you want me to invite as guests, and I'll be sure to do my best to follow your advice and to hear your voices. So have a wonderful rest of the day, wonderful rest of the week. Thanks so much for today, y'all. Thank you for joining me on Beyond the Accent, Speak Without Limits with Carrie. I hope you're feeling inspired, informed, and ready to use your voice with more confidence. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit follow so you never miss a new one. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram at carrie.on.accent and on YouTube for more tips, stories, and free resources to support your voice journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, your voice deserves the spotlight. Speak with confidence from the inside out. Without limits. Talk soon.